I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
Bill and I have discussed three topics this week. We talk about the president's announcements on steel and aluminum in Pittsburgh. We also cover the policy proposals by the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee, as well as Ambassador Tai's time with the committee and her testimony and where it might lead. Thanks for being here, and we hope you enjoy this episode of The Trade Guys.
Hi, Trade Guys. Good to see you both again.
Nice to be seen.
Been exciting. Well, in the week that's passed since we last got together. So you missed last week's episode, so we'll keep going.
For our listeners, Thibault was in Germany learning about Europe and the EU.
Thibault was in Germany, yes. Seeing Europe from the German side, which is not quite the same as the one I'm used to, but just as interesting.
But he learned they were fun people, which surprised me. Being one myself, I know we're not fun, but okay.
Bill, I think you're plenty fun, except when you give me some homework. But aside from that, you're great to be around. Guys, our first topic today is reminiscent of episodes that we recorded not that long ago. We have another steel story, for one. The Biden admin is courting the industry again with an announcement during a visit to Pittsburgh on Wednesday. Biden will propose 25% tariffs on certain Chinese steel and aluminum products as part of an ongoing review. Meanwhile, the United States will also launch a formal probe into China's shipbuilding industry. So, guys, how will this impact U.S. steel importers? And are there industries that are particularly exposed here?
The big news was the tariff, as Thibault said. But in fact, he proposed a lot of things. And the tariff is actually, I think, the least of them. If you look at last year's data, Chinese steel imports, direct steel imports, were only 2.59% of our total steel imports. And Chinese aluminum imports were only 4.16% of our total aluminum imports. So they're small. And the reason they're small is, particularly in steel, is because we've really knocked the Chinese out of the market through dumping duties and subsidy duties in past cases, demonstrating that up to a point, trade law has an effect. So tripling the tariff, which is what he proposed, which takes it from 7.5 to close to 25, is not really going to make that much of a direct difference because the amount of steel that will be affected by it coming in is not that great. I think the more significant thing that he did, which is shining a light on something that was already underway, which is directing his people to work with the Mexicans to prevent circumvention. Because what we are beginning to see is Chinese steel and aluminum coming into Mexico and then being either, depending on the case, either relabeled or transformed from slab to wire or rod or plate or sheet, whatever. And technically, that's a substantial transformation under customs rules that makes it a product of Mexico, but it's really Chinese steel. And when you put on tariffs, even when you triple them like the president did, it's the proverbial squeezing the balloon, and you just shut one door and 3 or 4 other doors open somewhere else. So there's a big overcapacity problem. There's a big surplus problem, and it's China's problem. And unless we can make them eat it through multilateral concerted action, it's just going to show up somewhere else. And then it's going to come in here as a third country import. So getting a handle on that, I think, was an important element of what he proposed. He also proposed the shipbuilding 301, which I imagine Scott will want to talk about. But he also did something that I hadn't expected, which was, once again, validating the marathon idea of the running faster or tripping the other guy. Tariffs are tripping the other guy, as we discussed before. But he also has committed $1.5 billion from the infrastructure bill several years ago to finance 6 clean iron and steel projects. and an additional $75 million to build the only high silicon grain-oriented electrical steel plant in the U.S. And of course, to the surprise of nobody, these plants are all going to be in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and there's going to be some in the South and Midwest as well. And he's also coming out with $500 million for the Cleveland Cliffs plant in Middletown, Ohio, to produce clean steel. So I was just on the phone with a reporter talking about this and commented that Trump has one tool in his toolbox, which is tariffs. And so if the question is, how is this different from what Trump would have done? The answer is on the tariff front, probably not very much. But Biden also gets the run faster part. And a good part of this announcement is focused on how do we make our steel industry more competitive and how do we make it greener? How do we reduce its emissions and help it develop more advanced technologies that will be greener? And that would be win-win, win for the environment, win for our industry, and actually a third win for our workers. So I think if you look at the totality of the announcement, it's more sophisticated and thoughtful and comprehensive than if you just look at the single issue of the tariff.
It strikes me that Bill's right that you have to look beyond the tariffs to find anything positive. And certainly investing in clean steel manufacturing, the federal government does a lot worse things with money than invested it in industries like this. So I would say of all the things that federal dollars get spent on, this is not a terrible one. But having said that, first, I'm surprised at the extent to which, first, the tariffs are seen as a positive, because it's fairly clear, as Bill noted, that diminishing returns have set in. And if you look at the whole time that's passed since President Trump put in Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, which was 2018, the industry has shrank since then. Okay, there are about 3,000 fewer people employed in steel production, not downstream, but there's actually steel production. So the industry is declining, so didn't really create jobs the first time. We have an additional layer of tariffs now. As I recall, our friends at the Peterson Institute did the math on sort of how much it cost for each job saved back in the 232 days. And it was close to $1 million in cost per job. So this is, it's unfortunate that we've resorted to these things. I think making the industry more competitive is a good thing, but we're rejecting some of that too by saying the U.S. Steel ought to be American owned, because for me, the main benefit, and I think the board of directors of U.S. Steel thought that the Nippon Steel was a better offer for acquisition, mainly because of the better technology that's available. So there are many ways to improve the productivity and sustainability of the industry. Federal dollars are one, but frankly, the Nippon Steel, I thought, presented a much better case for innovation and technology. That said, what really strikes me about all this is how this is Tariff Man's world. We just happen to be living in it. We have the Biden administration picking up on unilateral actions of reviving Section 301, which lots of criticism of that when President Trump did it. And you also have sort of this win-lose attitude that was a key problem for most of us who deal in the world of international trade. But it's also seeped into a lot of the things that we heard rhetorically from President Trump, which is that almost every problem is a result of unfair tactics or unfair practices by foreigners. I mean, look, shipbuilding is a problem. U.S. shipbuilding is highly uncompetitive. And will China do some subsidies which are trade distorting to build a shipbuilding industry? Oh, probably. But I would note a story that ran a week ago where the Secretary of the Navy toured an ally's shipbuilding facility, in this case in South Korea, was astonished by the leading edge technology that was being demonstrated. Well, we don't have anything near that. So the fact that China may subsidize in a trade distorting manner its shipbuilding industry is incidental compared to the uncompetitiveness of the domestic industry. And we could do a lot of things to improve that we're not doing. So it's one of those things. If we're back to the story where a surplus is good, a deficit's bad, any business problem is the problem of unfair competition from foreign entities. I just think it's a disappointment to see that it's the thing of everybody in Washington these days. So I hate to see the Tariff Man win. This program got started because of Tariff Man, so I guess the trade guys are the winners. But it's one of those things that that seems to be the only policy position that gets supported. So
shipbuilding and steel, to an even larger extent, are two particularly sensitive industries in the United States. But do you think this signals that this idea of winning and losing in trade is going to become much more prevalent in other sectors as well?
Hard to say. And there's certainly, as Bill has pointed out in past episodes, in some cases, the policies are in conflict. You want domestic manufacturing to prevail, but at the same time, you have a climate agenda, which is supporting some of it, but making a lot of it difficult. So there are always trade-offs in any policy discussion. And this one seems to lean heavily on arguments that candidate Trump and President Trump made 5 or 6 years ago. And it seems to have really taken over the thinking in Washington.
Guys, let's move into our second topic. We're seeing some movement on Capitol Hill. The House Ways and Means Committee marked up a raft of bill seemingly targeting economic competition with China, as well as the Biden administration's approach to trade. So, guys, can you tell us a bit about what the House Ways and Means Committee did this week?
Well, they were busy, which is nice because it's been a while since they've been busy. It turned out to be a partisan affair. I think almost all of the bills passed on a party line vote. And some of that was the usual not invented here problem. The Democrats were upset because they were surprised and nobody told them about it until the Monday night before the Wednesday morning markup. They were not, and their names weren't on the bill. I mean, we're dealing with issues that have been kicking around for a long time. Renewal of the Generalized System of Preferences Program, GSP, dealing with the Minimus program in particular, and a couple other issues. But in the end, they were party line votes, partly, I said, because of their bills and not our bills, so we have to oppose them, which is unfortunate. The other reason is that the Democrats have always wanted to tie TAA renewal to it. The Republicans didn't do that. They have historically not been fans of trade adjustment assistance, which I've never really understood because it's a relatively small program and it's intended basically to deal with the victims of free trade. And it's always been, since the 60s, part of the bargain. The government liberalizes trade, but feels an obligation to help out the people that have lost because of that liberalization. And there's always been that link. Nevertheless, it's always a close call getting it renewed. So I think the Democrats voted against these things, and also because it was as a protest, because the TAA wasn't included. Now, that said, what did they do? We don't have time to go into a lot of details. They renewed GSP for 10 years, which is probably less than it sounds because it's been expired for 3 years, and they've renewed it retroactively. So everybody that had to pay duties for the last 3 years is going to get their money back. But 10-year renewal is a good thing. It means we'll go through the same thing again, either in 2030 or 2034, however the deal is phrased. It made some changes to the rules that most people believe are helpful. It added some labor provisions and some environment provisions that the Democrats wanted. The Democrats predictably said not good enough, but they're moving in that direction anyway. So I think that was a good thing. It wasn't a perfect thing. And that this is always the dilemma of politics. Do you let the perfect be the enemy of the good? The other thing they did that was a little bit different than what people expected is they dealt with the de minimis issue. We've discussed this before. It's the non-tariff status of items that come into the country largely via mail or express delivery that are that are valued below the de minimis level, which used to be $200 and in 2015 was raised to $800, which has then produced this enormous ballooning of the volume of packages coming in that are below that level, most of them from China, a lot of them apparel, which is a sensitive area, and also allegedly, and I think probably truthfully, a lot of them containing fentanyl or other drugs, and the theory that this would sneak them in. There have been a lot of proposals on what to do about it. Take the number back to $200, exclude China, period, exclude countries of concern, which includes China. Most complicated one was a reciprocal one that was introduced in the Senate, where our de minimis level for other countries would be equal to their de minimis level for us. So every country would be different, depending on what they did. It would be impossible to administer. What the House did actually was fairly simple. They said that products that are subject to Section 301 tariffs, which means a lot of Chinese goods, and other trade law remedies, so products that have dumping duties, countervailing duties, safeguard tariffs, or 232 tariffs, they're all kicked out of de minimis. So that would probably affect about half of all the shipments from China that are now coming into the country. So once again, not as far as some people wanted to go, but I think probably also something that deals with a problem that has become a much bigger problem than anybody anticipated in 2015 when the number was raised in the beginning. There were several other bills, but the only other one that I'll mention, because it deals with a timely issue, is a bill that would correct a mistake that I'm embarrassed to say we made when I was on congressional staff writing on this stuff in the 80s. We never got around to defining what an FTA is, what a free trade agreement is. Nowhere in law is there a definition. And that suddenly became relevant with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act that provides credit eligibility for products that are made with parts and components and minerals that are either American or come from countries with whom we have a free trade agreement. Unfortunately, the IRA didn't define free trade agreement either. And there's been a big argument ever since about what that means, because the first thing the administration did was negotiate a critical minerals agreement with Japan. And that irritated Congress. That said, A, not an FTA, and B, you didn't send it to us for approval, and C, you didn't consult us about it, so we're unhappy. And so this bill is basically, it defines FTA, and it defines it to be an international agreement that is, one, approved by Congress, and two, eliminates restrictions on substantially all trade with the other country. So the effect of that, I think it's not retroactive, so I don't think it'll affect the Japanese agreement. The effect of that will make it much more difficult to negotiate critical minerals agreements with entities like the EU or with countries that with whom we don't have a free trade agreement. That's good news for Chile. It's good news for Australia. It's good news for Colombia and Peru because we do have FTAs with them. But it's bad news for the EU. It's bad news for the Indonesians.
If I can go back to de minimis, I want to credit the committee for what I think is a very thoughtful policy solution to the controversy by keeping the de minimis level relatively high, which was chosen for, I think, good reasons of risk management and was supported by Customs and Border Protection when it happened because it allowed them to better focus on the big problems. But they've also identified issues for exporters where there are other trade remedies being imposed and reduce the at least the easy way to evade those restrictions. So I think it's good policy. I would also note that it probably gets the number of shipments and the share of imports that are subject to these de minimis claims back to where it was before. So, for instance, in 2018, there was 29 billion of shipments worth of shipments which were under the de minimis limit. That was 1.1% of all imports. In 2020, it rose to $67 billion. But keep in mind, there's $2.3 trillion worth of total imports. So even that $67 billion number, which sounds large, is less than 3% of total imports. But by excluding, in this case, anybody subject to a 301 or other trade remedies, you're probably going to get back to that 1% to 2% of trade. And in the meantime, they preserved what was working well for small importers and ultimately small businesses who used the higher de minimis to handle normal business practices like returns from foreign customers. So there is some merit both in risk management and in small business to keep the high dollar level on de minimis, but by excluding essentially products subject to other trade action, I think is something that you can live with in the future. So I actually think they came up with a pretty sensible way to sort of split the baby. Sooner or later, we'll live with the definition of free trade, but I do think that what's behind this that nobody talked about, sort of the elephant in the room, is we don't really have a method for the administration and Congress to get together on these issues. What the Congress proposed for the Taiwan Free Trade Agreement was a way to get the quantum cooperation that is really needed because of the constitutional authority split, and without going through the trouble of passing a general grant of trade promotion authority. But that was rejected by the administration. So we're still in this odd state where we know both the administration and the Congress have powers that you have to work together to get anything done. And we still figured out how to do that. So
that's a good segue into my question about this, which is, Bill, as you mentioned, the bills have been voted on mostly along party lines. So where are we going now? What's their future?
Well, that's a good question. I think when I took some soundings up there before this came out, people were gloomy about any of this getting across the finish line in an election year. Usually, because the House is so closely divided now, if something is not bipartisan, it's difficult to bring it to the floor. This is not clearly not of the same priority as aid to Israel or aid to Ukraine or some of the other things that the House is going to be taking up. And it has to originate in the House because these are revenue bills under the Constitution. So I don't know if they'll come to the floor or not. The people I talked to up there thought maybe after the election there would be time for it. But I think as long as there's united Democratic resistance, it'll be difficult. Now, as I implied in my comments, there's a deal out there to be made. If the Republicans are prepared to support TAA renewal, which is not a big number as far as money is concerned, and not exactly a precedent since it's been in effect for 60 years in various formulations. If they're prepared to do that, I think there's a deal that could be made here, and that would make it a lot easier. But in the absence of that, I think I'm not optimistic about it getting across the finish line.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just a little over 6 months till Election Day. And so it's going to get more difficult, not less difficult, particularly on matters that don't have strong support across the aisle.
It's not a Trade Guys episode without some sort of gloomy prognostic. Guys, our last story of the day is also taking place on Capitol Hill. U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai testified to the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee earlier this week. So, guys, what were the key focus areas during her testimonies?
Well, what struck me is the notion that we're going to get some of this squared away and really get to work in the next 6 months. Really? It was a stretch. There were, of course, a lot of criticisms which were partisan and intended to please constituents because it's a general election in the fall. But more importantly, I think there's a sense that we've lost a lot of time in this particular administration, and the trade hasn't been a priority, and the things that they want to move from here on, even where they have statutory authority to proceed, it'll either be really busy or a really disappointing 6 months.
I had some And my takeaways were first something that I learned personally when I interviewed her a couple of years ago in a public event. She is really, really good at deflecting questions that she doesn't want to answer. And it's a gift. Not everybody can do that. And she does it very, very well. At the same time, I think my takeaway from the 2 days of hearings was patience is running out up there with her. I mean, she came from the Hill, a lot of goodwill. She was the only cabinet member that was confirmed without any no votes back in 2021. But people are running out of patience. I mean, the Republicans, you would expect to run out of patience because they're the other party. But there were clear signals from the Democrats, particularly in the Senate, that there's a remarkable lack of finishing things, lack of accomplishments, missed opportunities, and things are simply taking a very long time. And it actually was kind of amusing at one point. She was pressed fairly hard on the question, the China 301 tariffs and what they're going to do about them. And one member pointed out that the 2-year anniversary of studying the problem is coming up next month in May, and it shouldn't take 2 years to figure out what you're going to do about this. And her response was, well, we didn't actually start the review until September of 2022. So it hasn't been 2 years. It's been 1 2/3 years. Either way, that's a nice deflection, but it misses the point. The point is this has taken a really long time. And I think it's really, to me, it's taken a really long time because there is no politically winning solution here. Anything that she does is going to be too little for business and too much for labor. And so the answer is we will study the problem. And she said multiple times in the last 2 days that she expects a result soon on this. And I think it sounded from one of the things the president said in Pittsburgh yesterday that she was getting some encouragement for the White House to finish this up. So maybe we will see something soon. My guess is that you will see, but one thing you will surely see is an increase in the steel and aluminum tariffs tripling, because when the president says, I think you should do this, the cabinet member tends to take that seriously. So look for that. I think you'll see some other increases. There's been a lot of pressure to do something on electric vehicles, even though, yes, another area where Chinese direct EV imports are de minimis, but not coming in under de minimis, I should say, but they're minimal. Let's put it that way. And there's been some talk of also tariffs on Chinese legacy chips, which I think misses the point because most of the chips come in as embedded in other products. So they come in as your toaster or your laptop or your refrigerator or your car for that matter. Well, not Chinese cars, but they come in embedded in other products. So a tariff on chips alone wouldn't make that much difference. So I would expect if they ever do finish to see some increases. I would also expect to see some of them go away. You know, there are 429 exclusions that have been extended since December of 2021 or 2022. I forget which. If they keep extending them, they could just wipe them out, you know, and just simplify everybody's life. And there's probably a number of others that the sensible thing to do is to get rid of the tariffs. But as I said, that it's a fraught issue politically, because if they get rid of any, they'll be criticized, regardless of merit. They'll be criticized by the Republicans and probably also by the Democrats for doing too much. So she took a lot of heat for that. And, you know, in fairness, I don't want to be fair. I'm not particularly sympathetic. I mean, you know, the job involves making decisions. And sometimes it involves making a hard decision. You know, she doesn't want to make them.
The reason we have a U.S. Trade Representative's office, the reason it has cabinet rank, is to complete trade agreements. That is the main driver of American trade policy, is to negotiate agreements. And there's not much to show in this administration for that what I consider core activity.
She also took some heat on the digital trade issue, which we've discussed before. I think well-deserved heat. Didn't sound like there was too much pushback on IPEF, which surprised me a little bit, but we'll see if that comes back. But the Republicans in the House also pushed hard on agriculture trade, which is no surprise because the chairman of the trade subcommittee represents geographically most of Nebraska and is very much focused on agriculture. The chairman of the full committee is from Missouri. So there was a lot of pushback on her to do more on agriculture. We are now running into, I guess, our third year of agriculture trade deficits, which is new. For the previous 20 plus, we had a surplus, and now we don't anymore. And it's becoming a much bigger issue. And the Republicans are digging her, I think, basically for two things: missed opportunities, meaning missed opportunities to negotiate market access for our agriculture products, and also not enforcing the rules. She took a big hit on enforcement in both bodies of simply not bringing enough cases, not making enough complaints, not pushing hard enough. And of course, that produced another irony in the conversation because she said, well, a lot of those things didn't work. And we're going to do things that are effective. We're not going to do things that are ineffective. Of course, that ignores the fact that they haven't done anything about the 301s, which are exactly what she's claiming did not work, yet they're still here. So I congratulate them for searching for new tools, but the old tools still have some bite in them, and they really have not been applied as aggressively as they could be. So I think that the Congress has a point.
Going to Europe last week, one of the main conclusions of our delegation was that agriculture was one of the main reasons trade policy might get done in the United States. And trade policy, agriculture was also one of the main reasons trade policy might not get done in Europe.
Well, I think that was well said. I think if you listen to what the Europeans say about the WTO, and particularly if you look at their record on agriculture, it's more proof of what we said on this podcast before. There's no WTO rule against hypocrisy. And the Europeans are very proud to attack us every time we deviate from WTO rules. And they, of course, ignore their own deviations, most prominently on GMOs and a range of other agriculture issues. But it's timely because there's going to be a farm bill this year. Well, maybe there will be a farm bill last year. It was supposed to be a farm bill last year, and it's just been extended. But they need to do that, and you may see some trade provisions finding their way into that, which would be an interesting and kind of unexpected trade debate.
But it's not difficult to see why people are unhappy and on Capitol Hill. And so we're probably not going to make anybody very happy between now and November. We'll just have to see what we can write out.
We'll see if we can make people happy after November. Guys, thanks so much for another great episode. I will see you another week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To our listeners, if you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.